Okay, hello. Looks like we are recording now. So this is our second discussion regarding our current research project. And just to sort of recap what we're doing there, our subject is Amazon's Mechanical Turk, which is a crowdsourced job platform. I mean, I guess that's probably the best description of it. It tends to post jobs that are in ways very, very rote, right? I mean, in fact, its niche is that we're talking about job tasks that are trivial in ways that defy mechanization, right? So it's not even so much that they're just more rote than computers can handle, but they are rote in ways that that are trivial for humans but complicated for machines. And so that's why we're looking at this, because it shows the seams of the differences between humans and non-human agents, right? When we talk about human agency, as we'd like to in this project, we sometimes compute that in ways. That's a weird metaphor. We sometimes think of that in ways that are grandiose, right? We have this kind of capacity, creative capacity, or moral or ethical capacity that machines do not. And that's certainly one way to observe it. But if we shift down to sort of the other end where we are, we're looking at just very mechanical, very menial things, right? And seeing in what ways are human agents and non-human agents different when we're talking about, for lack of a better word, mechanical things. Right? So that's sort of what we're looking at. Our research question, and Nathaniel, feel free to revise as I'm monologuing. Our research question at this point is still sort of general. It's essentially that. In what ways does Mechanical Turk, through its job posts, rhetorically communicate a model of humanity, I suppose we could say. At this juncture, we're still kind of hashing out, do we want to focus on human intelligence, human agency, right? Those terms, of course, have their own kind of baggage in rhetorical studies. That's sort of generally where we are right now. Is that a fair statement?
I think so, yeah. I mean, I think the interest for us in terms of our approach is less sort of assessing Mechanical Turks in terms of how it's fitting with models of humans versus machines, but more sort of learning from it how it's defining for itself what the differences between those things are. So rather than kind of assessing it in terms of how it's treating the human, we're sort of leaving open the question of that and seeing how the ways that Mechanical Turks is set up, the language it uses to articulate itself, how it's generating its own understanding, right? What divisions is it making, as opposed to using our own preloaded divisions to kind of assess Mechanical Turks. So I can imagine someone imagining this as a kind of critical project where, loaded up with the definition of what the human is, we then go into Mechanical Turks and seeing whether or not it maps onto that, and then that allows us to either like it or dislike it, right, to sort of pronounce some critique of it, where I think what we're interested in is actually just sort of tracing what it's doing and using that to sort of abstract after the fact, perhaps, right, what it is, in a Latourian kind of sense, right? We're letting Mechanical Turks tell us what it thinks the difference between a human and a machine is.
Yeah. And so that perhaps underscores something we haven't addressed, sort of two things. One would be our method at this point, because we are thinking of doing essentially a content analysis of these postings, right? Yeah. So looking at its language, and it's why this resonates with something like rhetoric studies, because a lot of times, what we're talking about here is a largely textual medium, right? We're talking about jobs or tasks. The terminology they use is HITs, human intelligence tasks, essentially. So the language it's using to define those things. So that's one aspect, is the method we're using. How are we going to collect some of these? Because and we haven't gotten into the weeds of this, but it's kind of a fire hose where there's just a lot of these, and they're very small tasks for which people are paid very little money, generally cents, right? You'll do something like, identify the dogs in this series of 10 pictures, because in part what's being done here is training machine learning algorithms, curiously. And for that, you'll get a couple of cents. And so you can do a lot of these rapidly and approach the level of minimum wage, although, and this is something we'll probably have to engage, it's still, from an economic perspective, pretty exploitative. I mean, without having a unified definition of what exploitative is, probably most would incorporate this. So the method is one thing that we'd address. And then also, as you alluded to, partnership between humans and machines. And in fact, that's why we're doing what we're doing right now, and why we're approaching our scholarship through this sort of open collaborative model, wherein we're attempting to treat machines as much as possible agential partners, and also ideally incorporating other humans, of course. But it's why we're using this mode to collaborate, is in part to mesh with the subject itself.
Yeah, I think that makes sense.
Right.
And I think the way that which we're sort of going to engage Mechanical Turks, I think we talked last time about not just, we got to sort of get in there just to get access to the corpus, but also, doing some of those hits.
Yeah.
In terms of seeing how we ourselves get positioned when we get in there and start doing some of these tasks.
Yeah. And maybe that's a segue, because intentionally we haven't been keeping in close contact about what kind of research we've been doing, because we want to, as much as possible, make this public and shared, right? So, these conversations are as they occur. We don't really prep for those, which is convenient.
And probably noticeable.
Yeah. And we don't edit them. So, laziness wins. So maybe that's a good segue there in terms of what's developed since our last conversation. I guess one thing is we do have a publishing partner for this. We'll be working with Intermezzo, which is part of Enculturation. Excuse me. And so we'll be coordinating with them in terms of how do we rope these different things together, because, in addition to things like these videos, we'll have shared documents. We just, in fact, kind of looked at using web annotation software, but we're also, of course, doing things like Google Docs, and we're looking at other tools we can use for collaboration. Yeah. What have you kind of thought about in terms of our workflow?
Oh, kind of that's sort of, I jumped the gun a little bit and messaged you, and then you point out we should probably be recording this, is thinking about using something like Hypothesis, which allows basically to annotate anything on the web, and thinking about how we can use that both to sort of share things, right? As Jeremy mentioned, we kind of go off on our own and sort of dig up stuff and start thinking about things, and then sort of come together on these to kind of discuss that. So, are there ways of collecting that, right? So in a certain sense, how do we share things with each other, but sharing those with each other in ways that allow other people to kind of access those and even comment on them. So, one of the things we talked about last time was the idea that people watching these could, to a certain extent, chime in and respond to points that we'd made or questions that we posed. Mm-hmm. But it might also be interesting if people were then sort of reading along with the sources that we were using, and chiming in there as well. So not necessarily responding to us directly, but responding to us through the kinds of things that we were reading. As I was sort of collecting things today to kind of think about in terms of just researching, right, sort of things that had been said about Mechanical Turks and other contexts that Jeremy and I went back and sort of rewatched our last conversation, and then was sort of researching as I had that on in the background. So finding stuff about the exploitative labor practices, that kind of stuff, looking at the demographics of who's engaging in Mechanical Turks, and then thinking about, right now, how do I share this with Jeremy, and then share it in a way that would allow other people to kind of chime in on that. So not necessarily responding to the kinds of conclusions we had drawn, but actually pointing to things in the sources that we were using that would kind of direct us to maybe passages in an article or a text that we had overlooked.
Yeah.
So kind of contributing at that, but even at that level, right? Not just responding to in progress drafts,
right?
But actually reading along with us in some of the sort of secondary research we might be doing to help us understand the kinds of primary research we'd start doing with the corpus of the Mechanical Turk sort of job ads and tasks.
Yeah. And that's something, as you pointed out there, we are wanting to expose the in-progress drafts for comments, but you're right, it's a different thing. It's a different animal to do things like annotate sources, right? I mean, potentially some of that labor would come through in draft comments where people could say, oh, you know, highlight, have you heard this? But it's different and potentially differently transparent to try and share the materials that we're collating.
Right, like let someone make margin comments in the book that you're reading.
Yeah. So and you know, of course, we're still in the process of trying to wrangle all these things together in terms of what tools we'll be using to do that. And at this point, these video conversations are still one-on-one. You know, we haven't publicly done anything with our publisher yet. I was looking at a few other things as well. And I mean, right now, I guess let me screen share a few things here. Yeah, of course it's going to do that. I've been collecting some material just in terms of like thinking in a few different ways. One is, you know, how are we actually going to go about collecting these job posts? Because you know, even doing that presents its own kind of challenges.
Yeah.
Ideally, you know, and potentially once upon a time, you could use publicly available APIs to just kind of scrape these and then get, you know, do it periodically. And it looks like some folks have done that. Looks like Imperiotis, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but he has, let me pull up a few, in fact, has done work using precisely these kinds of methods, scraping those hits. However, it seems like the mechanisms he was using to do that aren't functional anymore. So, you know, he had this tracker, which you've noticed that I've done a strike through on, but it doesn't seem to function anymore. So, you know, I mean, speaking of Mechanical Turk, there are just some very human-centered ways of doing this. You know, get accounts and then just periodically go in on a schedule and just collect, you know, essentially just text export them and collect them that way. That might be a mechanism. I've considered just seeing if I could contact this person. He seems to be a working scholar, and see if maybe he has some ideas about, you know, if the mechanisms you've been using aren't functional now because of changes in APIs or whatever. How are you going about this? So maybe we don't have to try and reinvent the wheel here. Yeah, you're seeing this, right, when I'm sharing it?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. And he's done a handful of things here. I got his CV just because he's written a few different pieces, and then has this blog, which is fairly up to date, 18, that's looking at related material.
Yeah.
So I might try and see if I can just reach out and ask, you know, sort of point or concrete questions about, you know, how are you going about this kind of, because you can see even in 2018, he's still dealing with these questions of, you know, how many Mechanical Turk workers are there and where, you know, geographically, where do they distribute? Yeah. Because, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I mean, it does seem like a fairly like basic, quite like figuring out actually how many people are doing it.
Mm-hmm. And who these people are, because some of the things, I believe he's in business. Yeah. Computer scientist in a business school. And so he's looking at a lot of economic things, but with, you know, angles of, you know, is this a third world phenomenon, right? Where we see them as getting pennies a day, but might be a viable, you know, labor practice in other environments.
Yeah, I shared, there's a a piece I found on the Jacobin magazine, which is kind of a lefty publication, about what they call digital micro work, particularly in the Middle East, and how sort of American foreign policy has made this kind of work more appealing for people who live there, in similar ways in which sort of there's the kind of gold mining stuff that happens largely in China.
Like farming or
cryptocurrency? The farming kind of stuff. They connect those two things. They see the kind of mechanical Turk kind of labor as being akin to that kind of work as well.
Right. And that's, I suppose we should acknowledge, when we say mechanical Turk, that itself is a metaphor drawing from a literal thing that was purported to be an automaton that played chess. And I think it wore a turban. I think that's where it got its name. It was presented as being this exotic robot in 1700s. I should check. And in truth, what was going on was a person was wedged into this automaton, kind of in the desk area of this chess playing robot, and was making the moves. So the metaphor has come to signify work that appears to be or could be automated in mechanized ways, but is still being done by humans. And so there's lots of examples of this kind of thing in a lot of different industries. For example, we tend to think of our fancy devices being, well, surely those come shooting out of completely mechanized factories, when in fact, a lot of those are hand built in places like China. One of the main manufacturing differences between the United States and China, we're very much mechanized in this country, and that's why we don't have a large pool of factory workers. To be a factory worker now means you're an engineer or a roboticist. Mm-hmm. Whereas in many other countries, a lot of that, it just makes economic sense because you're paying lower wages and you don't have the same kind of tax issues and health concerns, those kind of things, just to pay people to do things like put together your iPad.
Right.
So it ranges in terms of what we're talking about, but generally this is labor that is being done by humans that seems like it either, could be or is being mechanized in other environments. In digital work, it's interesting because we see things that, for example, identifying photos that are tricky for computers. They're getting better based on our mechanical Turk labor because we are training them. But it's still tricky for them, and that's why it's interesting.
Yeah, there's actually, in some spots, this is referred to as artificial intelligence.
Right, sure. It's faked artificial intelligence.
Yeah, which I think really sort of leverages in on the mechanical Turk aspect of it.
Which was originally a con.
Right.
And this still has a little bit of a pejorative because, I saw it recently in the news because of Theranos, the blood company, has been really relevant of late because of the new documentary and that kind of thing. And occasionally its work was described as kind of a mechanical Turk shuffle game where, it was all predicated on this technology that could take a small amount of blood and do a lot of testing on it, right? But what was really going on behind the scenes was the technology wasn't working correctly, so they were essentially just sending it out to a lot of labs.
Right.
And so it occasionally is described as such, right? It's this kind of vaporware technology that underneath, it's just a lot of people doing a lot of work.
Right.
Anywho. So I was looking at that. I turned off my sharing here. I've also just been collecting a lot of notes. I've moved over to a Markdown workflow here. You use Markdown?
I have in the past.
I found my use case for it, and I'm busting. Moving everything over to Markdown now.
I have a GitHub account. Is that cool?
We're getting there. Yeah, sure. So I've been collecting some notes on a few different things. You can see a lot of them are links grouped into sort of categories here, right? Things like questions of the nature of the labor and if it's exploitative and in what ways.
Yeah.
A related aspect of this, which we may or may not talk about, probably we'd touch upon, but wouldn't drill into it. But one of the places that Mechanical Turk has kind of made its bones is in academic research. partially as a subject, but also as a mechanism. So for example, I mean, we can see a lot of work here in things like the social sciences. A good example is things like survey taking, right? Things that conventionally, you know, because you're on a campus, you'd get a psych or Soc 101 class, you know, of 300 students and say, fill out this survey about your whatever, you know, your browsing or eating habits or whatever.
Right.
Now it's effective to make that a job post on Amazon Mechanical Turk, and, you know, post the survey and say, I'll give you 5 cents or whatever if you fill this out. And it's, you know, it's become relevant for a lot of reasons. One, you know, potentially it's exploitative. Two, what's that doing to the results, particularly if the incentive is to race through it, right?
Right.
If the idea here is to complete as many as you can to scrape together a living wage, how much attention are you paying to any one task? I mean, you can't. So you've got to race through that. What's that doing to our data if we're using that as a data pool, right?
Yeah.
So there's lots of questions in academia about its use as a research tool.
Yeah, JSTOR had a piece up last year about how it's, I think that's something that we're looking at now, is that the Mechanical Turk has ushered in a golden age of survey research.
Yeah.
It's just like, it's an immediate, the person writing sort of talking about the idea of like this quote, right? I felt borderline incapacitated by the lack of easy, reliable options for getting a quick representative sample. Then I discovered Mechanical Turk and my data superpowers were restored, right? That all of a sudden this huge, ostensibly representative sample becomes available for pennies on the dollar.
Yeah. And I don't think we're going to, you know, I can say we're not going to be able to untangle all the implications of that.
No.
But I think it may be something that sets sort of the background of why we're looking at this, right? Because another thing we should point out is I think we've both kind of researched in rhetoric studies what other work is addressing this issue. Mm-hmm. And I personally haven't really come up with much of anything that's precisely in rhetoric studies looking at Amazon Mechanical Turk in these ways.
Yeah, agreed. I mean, I think there's stuff that's very much related, but as far as what it's actually looking at, I mean, as we mentioned last time, there's stuff on bots and algorithms and things like surveillance and wearables that I think are all kind of in a similar vein, but nothing I think that's particularly looking at this kind of this practice, particularly this kind of labor practice too, I think is also an interesting aspect of it. So I think a lot of these things, if they're looking at the ways in which these things, sort of looking at the ways in which bots or algorithms behind the scenes are structuring digital interactions or relations, or looking at the ways in which you know, consumer technologies are changing the way that people navigate space, but looking less at kind of work that's being done in these areas, like the actual kind of labor of these kinds of things, I think is so. All to say that I think there's room here for something,
right?
But I do think there are ways that we can connect it back to what other folks are interested in.
Well, let's talk about that for a little bit, because one of the things that we talked about last time and we weren't quite resolved on, understandably, oops, it's going to keep doing that. I'm not in my usual setup, so I have to ping back and forth. I'm sharing now, am I not?
Yes.
Yeah. So we were kind of thinking about precisely that. What's the conversation that our work would be entering into, right? So we had some different heads here as possibilities, more composition-oriented questions, things of robo-grading. You know, does this fit into that conversation? Does this fit into questions of rhetoric and agency? This is a helpful note. The source Nathaniel mentioned, question mark.
I think it was I think that was the Miller piece on the robo grading.
I'm going to put that down here.
Luckily, during our last, I hardly mentioned any sources, so it's pretty easy to track down which one you're talking about.
But these questions of agency, which you know, is at this point kind of a, in some ways, fraught term, but you know, that's fine. I mean, there is a conversation at least to be entered there. These other questions of literacy also emerged. We mentioned things like what Casey Boyle is doing with citizenship and the city and shared sensing. My background stuff, this pertains to a talk I gave that actually was sort of at least one of the inception points of this work about mechanical Turks in what I call the era of techno illiteracy. And this conversation is one looking at, kind of following along with Ong and Ulmer, this notion of literacy, orality, and then literacy as in, the human encryption and decryption of symbols. And then moving into, and at this point, sort of an unknown era. My assertion was we're moving into an era in which we are no longer the symbol readers primarily, but the symbols to be read, right?
Yeah.
So the machines become primary readers of us, of our kind of behavior. And so that was one of the potential conversations as well. Does this fit into a notion of literacy and potentially a shift from, in partnership with machines, being symbol readers to symbols that are read? What do you think about the conversation? I mean, what, because, we can't do all of this. What's the circle we're drawing around in terms of, peer work?
Yeah. I think that the kind of interesting thing is less. The agency thing is sort of interesting. There's also a sense in which, beyond being fraught, it also, to a certain extent, feels somewhat played out.
Right. Yeah. When I say fraught, I'm wondering if exactly what you're saying.
The word is boring.
Right. Yeah. So there is that danger.
Yeah, but I think what's interesting about it is, or what's potentially interesting about this is really not focusing on agency so much as how particular kinds of practices are divided up. Is there a way that we can sort of get at agency by not necessarily talking about agency? And just sort of looking at the kinds of tasks that it may be that one of the interventions is we're talking about agency, but less as a kind of abstract concept, and instead just looking at a particular field of work and seeing who's being given what kind of work and seeing that as the kind of implication.
Well, is this, as you kind of alluded to earlier, a sort of a Latourian or an ANT kind of looking at a scenario and trying to trace out agents?
Right. Yeah, that it may be that one of the ways of dealing with agency is just understanding that it will, essentially, right, that if we have debates about agency, and some will view agency as, a feature of autonomous beings, humans, right? And then a more distributed sense of agency. But is there a sense in which, depending on a set of relations, right, they might be, like, there's a sense in which both can be right. Mm-hmm. And whatever that agency is emerges out of particular networks. And so what we're kind of interested in is, right, agency is whatever Mechanical Turk says agency is. Which is potentially fraught, right? Because the whole thing, as we point out, right, is that the motivating historical analogy is, a deception.
Right.
So the idea is, do we risk, is our method sort of, right, this is a perennial critique of something like Ant.
Right.
But it ends up not being all that critical because it takes, right, what if we took the Mechanical Turk at its word? Right, we would never open the box to see what's in it, right? We would think it's an actual automaton that's playing chess. And then we grant it all of these capacities that it doesn't actually have. But is there a benefit in risking that, right? The idea that, and now I don't even know what I mean by that, but
yeah,
there's the risk that our research will get conned. Like we'll be conned by what it is that we're looking at.
Right.
That what we end up understanding or describing as agency won't actually, right? I mean, this is sort of Latour's instinct that it's just description and no explanation, right? You just describe and write, right? If we did that, would we just be describing this automaton, and then someone else comes in and offers an explanation, and then we now see that there was actually a person inside all along?
Yeah.
Or
sorry, go ahead.
Or if we jump straight to the explanation, right? And there's also a sense in which you could reread that Mechanical Turk example, right? I mean, the way that it gets read as deception is right. What you think is there's this machine doing this thing, but what's really happening is a person inside is doing it. But what you could also say is, well, what's really happening is they're both involved in producing the
partners. Yeah, you don't do that without the machine. The machine is an equal partner. To say it's a deception is inherently kind of anthropocentric.
Right.
Saying, well, it's lying to us and we are what is.
Yeah.
Right? The chess machine may have told a different story.
Yeah. And the person is manipulating the articulated limbs of the Mechanical Turk, but those mechanical limbs are part of the effect that's being produced, right? It's not again, to go back to Latour, the Mechanical Turk's not reducible to the person inside the box.
Yeah.
You can't explain one using the other. You have to describe what they're both doing together. And so I think that may be how we enter into the agency thing, right? That we're not seeing the agency as attributable to one or the other.
Right.
But more interested in just tracing the effects of particular mergers and interactions.
I mean, I wonder, and it's probably not something we can answer at this juncture, but I mean, if it's even possible just to acknowledge that in some sense, in the text, or maybe even just a literal sense, right? That, whether or not we actually use the term agency, here's what we're attempting to do. And even if we're not resolving it, we're aware of the caveats involved in this.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me that we're less invested in agency itself and more interested in what kinds of cuts are getting made by the apparatus of Mechanical Turks. And one of those cuts might be the ways in which it carves out agency. But that's just one possible effect of Mechanical Turks, is that it reorients us to agency, but it might do a whole lot of other stuff as well. So I think not only do we not want to go in with a sense of what agency is,
right,
we probably shouldn't even go in with an expectation that a sense of agency is what we'll get from it.
So then that brings me to this, which is kind of underpinning this, is the next step as we go forward. Do you think it's researching, and I mean, I know we both sort of have our own habits, but I mean, do you think it's researching these kinds of questions, or do you think the next productive step is to get our hands into the data and see if it suggests the kind of theoretical grounding that would be appropriate? Because as you say, I mean, what happens if you wade into the data and it's like, well, this doesn't match up with the orientation I assumed, right?
Yeah.
I mean, does it sort of make sense to try and get our hands on the data at least a little bit and see what kind of things are popping out, and then go in that direction, try and then find theoretical work that explicates this?
I mean, my sense is, and I shared this with you, and maybe I'll pull it up. Maybe I'll share my screen really quickly.
Do you have the ability to do that?
We're about to find out. Yep.
Okay.
I mean, I have the button. I clicked the button.
I'm seeing you, but we'll check the video later, I guess.
Now we got it?
Yeah. Yep.
Okay. So it's this piece from 1995 by Bruno Latour and a computer scientist named Genevieve Tell, called The Hume Machine.
Yeah, you mentioned that. That's in my notes that you mentioned that.
And it's basically sort of not pre-DH, but sort of imagining that basically the argument they make is that what makes computers particularly interesting for doing sort of antish work is the fact that they just produce associations, and that you don't need a kind of form to then understand stuff, but that those things sort of, that the computer will kind of generate these. And so there's this one of
that sounds very the promise of big data was
Yeah.
theoryless correlation, right? That if we just have billions and billions of examples, you don't need a driving theory. You get the correlations.
Yeah. So it particularly has that, I guess, that risk or that caveat. Right. This simple network of unstructured co-occurrences enables us to produce structuring differentiations. Right. The idea that kind of what we're looking for is, right, as we go into the text, right, looking at the ways in which particular tasks are described. And right, if we look for co-occurrences of those descriptions, what kinds of differentiations do those produce? I think what's interesting for us is we're less interested in what, and now this is, and now I mean, I was always making this up as I was going along, but I'm making it up as I'm going along now. That we're not using, that we're not, I don't think Mechanical Turk is learning anything in the sense that we're not going to use Mechanical Turk to describe something that's going on independent of, like, Mechanical Turk for us is not a lens that we're looking through to see something.
Right.
Right. That what we're actually interested in is seeing the effects that Mechanical Turks produces. And so I think oftentimes the way that big data gets used is big data is seen as a way of a theoryless understanding of what's going on, right? It's a way of accessing reality. And I think what's happening here, and I think you're interested in Mechanical Turk, is not what Mechanical Turk teaches us about what's really going on, but how Mechanical Turks is itself participating in the construction of what's going on.
Yeah.
Right? That we're not using Mechanical Turks representationally.
Does that have the caveat of treating it as kind of a black box? We can't know it. We can only know its products. I
mean, potentially, right? That's the risk, right? That there's some parts of this that remain, like, to a certain extent, we actually don't care what Mechanical Turk is. We care what it's doing. I mean, that's also the rhetorical way. And like, what makes our study rhetorical is not simply that we're looking at text.
Yeah.
That we're not interested in what Mechanical Turk is. We're interested in what differences it's generating.
Right. That's exactly what we're, on exactly the same page there. I was going to say that's the sort of the philosophy rhetoric split. We're not really curious about essentialist questions of, but what is it? What's really happening here? Rhetoric tends not to give an answer to that. It's like, I don't exactly know, but we can see what's happening. Right? We can deal in effects rather than in essences.
Yeah. So in that sense, right, I mean, that's why we're both talking about agency, but not talking about agency. I mean, there's a sense in which we're treating Mechanical Turk as not a thing that needs to be explained, but it's basically our informant, right? We're treating it as an actant or as an informant in the study that's going to teach us something.
Yeah.
With the risk, right, that with the Mechanical Turk, it's gonna hoodwink us as it does that.
But I guess that's always a risk. I mean, you can't be inured against every possible charge. You know what I mean? I mean, it's like,
oh yeah, I'm always ready and willing to be made a sucker.
Yeah, nothing is going to be bulletproof. I guess the best you can kind of do is acknowledge, in some sense, here, as far as we see it, here are the landmines in this field. And admittedly, we're not going to be able to see them all, but here's at least what we're trying to do.
And that's why Latour and Thiel like the idea of the computer as a human machine. Is that the machine doesn't care. It's just mapping these co-occurrences.
Yeah. So probably, I mean, I should probably read this then, at least this work, right?
I shared the PDF with you.
Okay.
In the hopes that you read.
Is that a passive aggressive hint?
Yeah, it is. It is. Yeah.
I got a lot of stuff going on. Okay. So yeah, I'll definitely mark down a note to that.
There you go.
Gives me a chance to mark things up. So yeah, I mean, we can read that. I guess another question might be, and this is putting you on the spot a little bit, but have you come across research that is a model, right? So it's like, well, we could adopt some of the things this work is doing. Mentioned maybe some of the rhetorical stuff looking at bots or algorithms. Are they?
Yeah, so there's two pieces. Let me go back to screen sharing so I can show you what these books look like. It's like it's an informal slide deck.
Yep. Yeah, that's why I work too, through tabs. Just got tons of tabs.
A lot of tabs. So this is Jim Brown Jr.'s ethical programs.
Yes, so, I know of that work, but I haven't read it.
Yeah, it's also, and they did this actually using hypothesis, what I suggested to you, that when it first launched, there was a kind of collective reading of it because it's available through the University of Michigan Press. It's available online for free as an ebook. But yeah, so Brown reads a range of computational strategies and actors, including the general principles underwriting the transmission control protocol. So kind of, I mean, he kind of looks, he sort of delves down into the kind of, like even as it says here, right, the kind of actors involved in putting together this kind of thing, right, and demonstrating the kind of rhetorical spaces network software establishes and the access it permits, prevents, and molds. I mean, there's the kind of ways in which that's sort of what our interest in Mechanical Turks is, right, as a kind of network space that is sort of molding particular kinds of tasks. And is there a way for us to kind of think about what those tasks are doing, right? That how is Mechanical Turks structuring human and non-human mergers or partnerships in ways that produce certain effects and don't produce others?
Yeah, and have you read that book yet?
Parts of it.
Okay.
And then this is Annette V's Coding Literacy: How Computer Program is Changing Writing. It's more kind of,
that seems more in line with the kind of other of those three branches that I brought up.
Yeah. But I think what's kind of interesting is it gets at how, right, not just learning coding literacy, but how the kind of logics of coding potentially changes the ways that people approach other kinds of writing. So in that sense, there's potentially a kind of, again, like one of the effects, right, that are there ways in which people who do, and this would be a whole other kind of like longitudinal psychological study, right? Are there ways in which people that do, shoot, what have I done? Cancel. Are there ways in which people who do sort of lots of hits, right? What kinds of larger impacts does it have on the ways in which they approach other tasks, right? If one did, like if we did like a Super Size Me style documentary and just did Mechanical Turk work for 30 days, would it change the way that we interact with other kinds of tasks, right? Would it produce workers that are more amenable to finer and finer levels of granularity in terms of the kind of work that they do?
Right.
But that seems like a kind of separate issue. But again, it might be one of the things that Mechanical Turks does, right? I mean, we've been talking a lot about the ways in which people engaged in Mechanical Turk work are training AI to do certain things. But is there a way in which it's also working as sort of workplace training for the people doing it?
Right, of course, yeah.
I mean, are there employers somewhere going, boy, I wish that my employees got really used to this kind of work? Particularly when you think about the idea that they're paid, it's sort of task-based payment as opposed to hourly. I mean, I could see this being a model that people would find interesting for all sorts of things. But is it a way of habituating people that do these human intelligence tasks?
Right. Well, so I mean, you sound pretty attuned to some potential. I mean, maybe this is a possible in terms of like what are our next steps. I'm certainly gonna take a look at some of this work. I'm also gonna share with you, maybe I already did, my previous presentation. Did you look through that at all, or did I share that with you?
I don't think you shared it with me, and you didn't passive aggressively nudge me into reading it, so I haven't.
I don't remember doing that, at least.
Yeah.
Because it has some potential resources there But I also might I might see about the sort of mechanics of the method of how are we going to collect this stuff, because that may be a bigger can of worms than is anticipated. So it may be useful to kind of start thinking about, how are we actually going to review this stuff? So maybe if I kind of start doing that, and then maybe if you're poking into some of these other contextual or theoretical concerns, that might be a good sort of next step thing.
Okay.
Yeah. Sorry, I was scrambling for some other.
That's fine. You might discover that that getting access to this, if it proves prohibitive, it may just be that it's just these two videos.
Right. I mean, there are ways to do it, although, as I mentioned, they themselves may be Mechanical Turk-esque. I mean, they may be kind of human-centric. The golden days of open APIs, this happened with Twitter and Facebook and everything too. They closed a lot of that up even for researchers. So it's tougher just to, pull all this data automatically.
Yeah. No, at some point you still have to go in, and I mean, I remember I was engaged in another project. We were just scanning lots of stuff.
Right.
And it might have been scanning notes or something, but it was something on postmodernism, and it had been abbreviated as POMO. And we had to go into the text once it had been OCR'd and switch all the things that said porno back to POMO because it had read the M as an R and an N. And right, we had to kind of, that was basically Mechanical Turk kind of work, like literally going in and becoming another level of ocular character recognition.
Cleaning things for the machine.
Right, because the machine had not, whereas you might imagine that would be the opposite, right? You would get it good enough, and then you'd have the precision of a computer going in. But basically, we were cleaning up after the kind of real work had been done, and literally in this case, cleaning up the actual language. It got blue.
Well, you can imagine why it would default to porno instead of POMO, right? I mean, which one of those is a canonical term?
It's true. I mean, in its defense, listen, I'm not casting aspersions on Adobe Professional, but who am I? But yeah, we had to catch it.
All right. Well, let's see. So it's been about an hour-ish.
That felt like a fun concluding anecdote.
Anecdotes about human and machine collaborations.
Uh-huh.
But I mean, so I think next steps, we can share some of these resources. And then, as I mentioned, I'd like to, of course, I'm teaching a methods class right now. So, of course, what I want to do is get some experience, or at least a sort of an overview of what the methodology or the method is going to be, because it feels like something that could be complicated.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, we can always just, if we're going to have a Mechanical Turk account, I mean, we can always chip in and pay someone else to do this.
Yeah, your job is to catalog all these other jobs.
Yeah.
Eesh, we're through the looking glass. Although someone's probably already doing it, because there are things like Chrome plugins that facilitate Mechanical Turk, so you don't have to check the website. So you can use a Chrome extension to keep everything kind of organized.
It's Mechanical Turks all the way down.
Yeah, it really is.
Boy, there's a working title. Yeah, and I guess
it's Turks all the way. It's Turkles all the way down.
Oh no, that's my hit piece against Sherry Turkle. I mean, I guess the other next step is to figure out how to posting these. I mean, at some point, do we want to bank some of these episodes and then roll them out, or do we want to get something up on Intermezzo more or less soon, and then thinking about how to share, in Hypothesis, is there a hashtag we want to direct people to?
Yeah, well, and that was my kind of next question is there anything we need to do with the publisher? And I think the answer to that is yes.
Yeah.
And I think one thing, because the publisher did point us towards some potential collaborative tech that, they may or may not want us to use, or at least look at.
Yeah. Manifold?
I believe, yeah, that's right. I believe that's correct. Because yes, I mean, it probably would be useful we'll take all this material and present it. But in that case, at least, it's interesting because I was going to say it would probably be better to have some stuff and then, have the publisher help kind of deal with publicity stuff, right? We're doing this.
Right.
If you're interested in this area, chime in. I mean, on the one hand, it would maybe seem like, well, if there's already stuff there, it might seem as though you're behind.
Right.
You as viewer might be behind. On the other hand, it might be, well, we have these kind of almost pilot-like. I mean, that's how I was presenting these video recordings as pilots.
Yeah.
In part because there's a lot of murder and adult situations in them.
Yeah, I'm hoping Yahoo Screen picks this up
for a 6-episode miniseries.
Yeah.
With a defunct web channel.
So that's our feed.
It's an interesting question about, is it more approachable if everybody's starting from a kind of ground zero, or is it helpful to say, just to orient viewers or readers or people to this? There is some material that you can look through, but you don't necessarily need it.
Right. How much is too much that makes it overwhelming, or too little that makes it look like it's like people's response is either I'm already behind or I'll wait until they get
finished. Yeah. Maybe the publisher could help us with that, but I mean, I can envision a world in which, these would be available, but not necessarily front and center. And, like the first one may be, in sort of a more live format, or we'd have to do some sort of like brief couple of minute distillation of the project, right? Much briefer.
Yeah. I mean, is one option that our next session, we actually bring some of the editors on board?
That's fine with me. Yeah. I mean, we're might as well move forward. So we could certainly bring some editors on board. I mean, in thinking about this also, as we move forward, it probably would be worthwhile to consider having other people, like, scholars who are writing in this area, if they'd be amenable to, hey, we have some questions, would you mind, being a guest?
I was even thinking, I mean, sort of all the sources I've been sharing, they got a sort of secondary list of these should then also be people that we have on at this stage or other stages.
Right, because if we're doing this, we might as well do it.
Yeah.
So that might be, this is reminding me all of a sudden of this course I taught on Netflix where the whole, it was so different from your normal pedagogical experience because the whole course was me trying to line up interviews with scholars and people producing binge material. It was bonkers, but I mean, it was very different from what your normal teaching experience was. Because it was 150 people and it was online. So I wasn't doing a lot of like, paper comments.
Right.
But I was doing a lot of PA work. I was a production assistant. But then I guess potentially editorial may do some of that lifting, right?
Yeah. I mean, I hope. I'm not planning on doing much work.
But maybe that then tells us part of next step would be let's talk to the publisher about, we have some questions and here are also some ideas we have in mind in terms of, having guests and
right.
Tools we might be wanting to use and that, we probably do need their input on pulling this all together.
Yeah. I mean, it's at some point I'm just imagining like, what's this going to actually look like, right? Will this be a kind of web text with a series of like a playlist of videos and then some embedded articles that we've read and some kind of live stream? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, my thinking, the way I've been positioning this as I've been asking for grant money, is yes, it would be probably an archive that's probably chronological, because part of the, even if people aren't participating live, there may be value in having an archive of how collaborative projects occur, right?
Yes.
So one model is, a chronological model. So yeah, ostensibly it would be something like a video clip and associated material that was discussed during that video discussion.
Right.
As a sort of chronological unit, and then another one, right? Materials and video and that kind of thing, along with ultimately a final written product.
Yeah. Oh, we're going to write something? I thought we were just going to just record some chats and then until we just got burnt out.
If I get any grant money, then yes, we are. that's in black and white. So we'll see.
Oh, we'll be obligated to deliver something. I see.
Yep.
Well, that seems fair, actually. Yeah. I'm okay with that. But yeah, I mean, just thinking about sort of what, I mean, the flip side, right? What, not just figuring out sort of the mechanics and techniques of Mechanical Turk, but actually what is available for us in terms of how this gets structured. And then imagining the multiple ways in that an audience might want or appreciate.
Yeah. And there are some, like one of the links I have was a person wrote a fictive novel called Pickwick, although the vowels are removed because it was, early enough in the century that
was neat.
Right, that we were doing that. And he wrote it in a similar format publicly, where he was live streaming as he was writing, and people could essentially suggest as he was composing.
Mm-hmm.
And, it was popular enough that people were doing that, right?
Didn't you mentioned this before, though? Didn't he ended up being somewhat ambivalent about the whole thing?
Oh, yes. I imagine that's where we will end up as well.
I mean, if all goes well, we'll regret this.
Right, yeah. As with all research things.
What were we thinking? It would be a good problem to have.
Right. Yeah, well, because I suspect a lot of the value of this will be retroactive, will be an archive of how collaborative work happens, right? Because the conversation we just had, this is the conversation that everyone who co-writes stuff has. Right. But a lot of that gets lost under the sheen of a finished product. And I mean, this is nothing new. We're aware of this, but we haven't really grappled with, so now what, right? I mean, are there ways to make things more transparent? Is that valuable, or is it just cumbersome? And so partially that's what this is exposing that.
Yeah, I know that one thing that I had explored when I was collaborating with somebody was I think it's probably still an option. You can take the address for a Google Doc, and there is a site that will turn it into a movie, a film. Right. That turns basically all the revision histories into and we thought that was interesting. And then, but we had not planned on doing that from the beginning. So we would have had to have heavily edited the video in those moments of sort of co-writing when you start yelling at each other and,
Right. Anywho.
I mean, those ways in which you can sort of show that process undertaking, right? A kind of vision or revision history or version history, I guess. So.
Sorry, I'm just jotting a note here. Whoops. Yeah, so
but yeah, how much of this is going to be valuable live or after the fact, and whether or not that distinction matters to how we actually do it.
I guess we'll have to see.
Yeah.
I don't think we can anticipate that, or at least maybe in the broad strokes we can, but and so yeah, I think probably what we'll want to do is talk to the publisher to get input on this and our plans, and then as I mentioned, I'm gonna see what I can do about getting the actual data, working up sort of the method of it.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll keep doing some more context stuff, and then maybe we'll set up a either something we record or just something we don't, but a meeting with the publisher and then whoever they have doing the production stuff, just to see what's possible, so we can kind of at least have some idea of what is it we're going to be able to share and make accessible in a way that's with with very little kind of overhead for people, right? I mean, even the idea of let's do something that doesn't require anybody to have to make an account to participate in.
Yeah, that's why I was a little hesitant about the web annotation stuff. Asking people to get an account. I mean, everybody's got a Google account probably, but I'm increasingly hesitant to say you just have to log in here. It's
right.
That's a big hurdle. It seems trivial, but particularly because you can't count. I mean, the more of your credentials you've got everywhere, it's. Yeah, and ideally, I think ideally we would record this with the editor as well. And I don't know. I wouldn't think they'd have a serious problem with it. We're not going to be. I mean, anything that's sensitive we could cut out, but I can't imagine anything sensitive coming up. So
no, we're not kind of engaged in gotcha scholarship. So, now that we have you on video and under oath, I have a bunch of other unrelated questions I want to ask you.
Right. Yeah, that's right. Well, that actually, that aspect, because what I thought you intended when you said that was, because I was talking about this with somebody and their immediate response was, aren't you afraid of sharing your ideas that they're going to get stolen? And I'm like, absolutely not.
Really?
First, yes. I was kind of naively, I suppose, surprised by that, because I was like, well, no, I mean, first off, that's kind of the point of scholarship, but also,
right.
I mean, but if nothing else, you're building a public auditing trail.
Right.
I mean, if anyone else publishes, you've got prior art that you can point to. I mean, unlike traditional scholarship where you just have to hope someone doesn't publish what you're doing before it comes out, which, everyone has kind of that weird horror story where you're halfway through something and then you read something, you're like, oh crap, somebody just did it,
Yeah.
Here it's like, well, I've already got the breadcrumbs out there. So, but it was interesting to me that, kind of this initial response was people are going to steal whatever you're doing that's of value. And I'm like, wow.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is a pretty good idea, but I don't think anybody's going to break into my house for it.
We'll see.
Plus, I mean, they'd be under the same. I mean, academic publishing moves so slowly.
Right. Yeah.
It's not like you're going to steal something and get a fast getaway.
Right. You're in the pipipeline behind me. So
you're still going to have to get peer reviewed, and that's going to take 6 months. Yeah.
Anywho.
Good luck.
All right. Let's do those in terms of next steps. I'm a brass tacks kind of dude. So we'll do those things, talk to the publisher. I'll start looking at the methods, and then I'll read some of that stuff, and I'll share my stuff with you as well.
I would be happy to read it.
Fantastic.
And offer any constructive criticism that I can.
Wonderful. I can't wait. I'm on tenterhooks.
Okay.
All right. I don't know how to end these either.
Yeah, turn it off.
I'll see you.